iFi's new iDSD Diablo is a portable headphone driving powerhouse. Let's check it out. Thanks to Headamp for sponsoring this review. Headamp are the makers of the legendary Blue Hawaii electrostatic headphone amplifier, as well as the Gilmore series of amps, including the new GSX Mini and Pico Power portable amp. They also sell the iDSD Diablo in this review. If you're after a complete headphone system, do check out their site. So the iDSD Diablo, I guess, is a successor to iFi's Micro iDSD series. It doesn't have Micro on it anymore in the name. And, well, it's big and red, but the most famous of this was the Black Label Micro series, and the last of that series wasn't actually black, it was blue, the iDSD signature, and I reviewed that recently. You can actually check that out. I'll put a little card up in the corner. And as we saw in the review of that, it's got, little stickers with marks on the bottom indicating all the features and things that they have, much like people who pimp up their cars, put stickers all over the back window. And it features galore, extra bass, 3D, power modes, digital filter modes, IEM match, kind of everything in the kitchen sink in there, and a lot of power in there to boot. And most of those features have been abolished in the Diablo. You'll see no fancy switches or pimping the design on here. It's much simpler. Supposedly was designed for the Chinese market, and I don't know, they guess they don't need these things or don't want them. I'm not sure. Well, at least iFi assumes they don't. The only thing that survived has been the power mode with Echo, Normal, and Turbo, which for those of you unfamiliar with iFi, I'll talk about. But the main change internally is that, apart from abolishing all the extra features, is that the circuit is now balanced, whereas the Black Label and the Signature was single-ended internally. Now, that means previously on the Signature, these two outputs were the same, essentially. Something I have to clarify, and people get this mucked up so often, there's no such thing as a balanced output. There's not a balanced socket, sorry. This is a 4.4mm Pentacon socket. This is a 6.3mm TRS socket. Do not use the word balanced with say a 4-pin XLR or whatever. The balanced is the circuit design, not the plug. Let me make that very clear. So even though this has a 4.4mm Pentacon in here, the circuit internally is not a balanced circuit. Now, for a portable device, you don't need it. This was more than powerful enough. The changes in the Diablo, which are significant, is that the amplification circuit has been upgraded. And it uses one with, I believe, cascading negative feedback. I may have my terms wrong, but it has multiple layers of negative feedback. It's much like a THX type amplifier. And it is balanced internally. So we still have the same Burr Brown, I think it's PCM 1793 DAC, and we still have much that same setup as we had in the previous Black Label and Signature, but it's the amplification circuit which is significantly different, and maybe there's some changes to the USB input, but we're coming to that. So these two inputs are now different. So this has less power than, the 6.3 has less power than the 4.4mm. And, well, that made for some good and some bad, and we'll talk about that in the sound impressions, but for that, to get maximum power out of it, you have to use now the 4.4mm socket, which makes me wonder why they didn't just make this 3.5mm, because the lower power one for in-ear monitors would have been perfect. You don't need balanced for in-ear monitors. It's just extra components which have to be more accurately matched and more money when you don't need it. Now, with the inputs, I'm going to go over the inputs for people who are not familiar with iFi. The USB power input, and now we have, because in the previous Signature we had an RCA set of RCA outputs. The whole thing was single-ended, not balanced. Now we have a balanced output, which could theoretically be converted to single-ended by using a cable that only uses the positive pins for each, the left and right channels, and just ignores the negative ones, and does the signal return via the ground, which is included on the 4.4mm connector, unlike things like the 2.5, which doesn't include it. Now, for input, power and USB input are separate, because if you connect it to a phone, you don't want it trying to drain the phone's battery. And some phones will just shut off the connection if you do that. SPDIF input, you can put in a mini Toslink connector, or you can adapt it with a cable or something like this, a little Sony 3.5mm TS tip sleeve connector to RCA, and they're Now we have a coax input. Now the normal input is via this USB-A plug. And again, for those of you who are not familiar, it's designed to work with things like phone extensions or whatever. This is just an Apple USB-C to USB-A socket. And there are plenty of these available out there. There's also, I show you my Lightning one to this, but I'm actually using it to make this video, so I can't do that. And you just plug that in, and then plug this into, say, a player or phone. I just happen to have a FIO M11 Pro here, which will just do for demonstration purposes. And ta-da, there you go. That's your old school portable stack. Thus, very chunky. It's good if you have an older player, or you have a player that maybe you use with in-ear monitors, and then when you want to use it with full-sized headphones, you could stack that up too. Probably have more storage than your phone does. And they actually have a case I'll show you in a bit too. But output, as we saw, there are 3 modes: echo, normal, and turbo, which are a little bit fiddly to get moving, but they're not likely to accidentally pop on and blow your ears out if you have in-ear monitors and suddenly you can't accidentally knock it to turbo, which could actually blow up your ears and blow up your in-ear monitors as well. This, in echo mode, it uses far less battery, and so the battery will last longer. And of course in turbo, I think you only get about 4 or 5 hours or something like that of use. But you can power full-sized headphones better because it puts out about 4 watts. Now, something to note about that is that's going to be class A/B power, and probably the distortion level at 4 watts or whatever is going to be pretty high. You're not going to get put 4 watts into your headphones unless you have things like Susvaras. I actually have Susvaras immediately in because I'm in front of my equipment rack at the moment. You can actually drive Susvaras from these, which is pretty impressive for a portable device, but it has a big battery in the middle. So that's not a surprise. I mean, even out of the Signature you could drive Susvaras. It had about the same amount of power output. It's because this new circuit is balanced that, well, the balanced is where you get the most power. But still, it does put out a couple of watts, I believe. Well, it's over 1.5 watts max. I forget. It's over a watt from this. So for most full-sized headphones, even the 6.3mm socket will be fine. Now, as usual, you have this annoying power and volume, and the battery is flat as I record this because I accidentally left it switched on. And the problem with that, of course, is you switch it on, then for up until about the 10 o'clock mark, you have massive channel imbalance, like you lose one channel. So your actual range of volume control is only about just over 180 degrees. So compare that to a normal volume control where you get not quite 360, you get about, well, 270 at least. That's not quite so ideal. And one of the problems I found with this, and this is where I tested with in-ear monitors, is the gain is too high. Even in echo mode, the power output is too high. Well, the gain is too high at least. What I think they should have done is made this 4.4 and 3.5mm and had this with IEM match included. So in echo mode, it had a setup adapted to in-ear monitors. The other thing is this is actually bigger. If we compare the size of both of these, you can see that the Diablo is bigger, which means less portable. I mean, it's the same size battery as far as I'm aware, and the same size components otherwise. They just changed the case to a rounder style one with 2 screws on the front and 2 on the back instead of the 4 of the older style case. So it looks neater, but I think they could have done a bit better in that regard. So the lack of an IEM match made it not so good with in-ear monitors. But again, where you buy this thing is for use with full-sized headphones primarily. That's its appeal. It's a portable powerhouse. And that it certainly did the job well. So actually another thing that's really cool about it is it comes with this case. Now the case, well, it's designed to put the Diablo inside, or actually the Signature will fit in there too, any of them. It has some Velcro inserts. Kind of place to put your cables or whatever, and there's one that was going across when it came here, but that's not quite going to fit. They're probably not in the most perfect position, and it has these holes at the top and bottom which you're supposed to stick cables through both ends. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to put the Diablo in here, and this is where it gets fiddly. I'll zip it up so I don't drop everything. And then you get your funky whatever adapter cable you want, and you stick that in the bottom, which in itself is a bit of a challenge. doable. Thus, and then you stick your phone on the back. It's got a couple of Velcro straps, and you stick your phone in here, and then plug it in through underneath, like so, and then your headphones in through here. The problem is, of course, you can't control the volume without unzipping it. Well, you can kind of open the top and then fiddle the volume there. But the other thing is, touchscreen. It's a nice try. I don't think it's complete. I mean, you want a longer cable here so you can pop this out and change songs. But I mean, if you're just reaching in here and the screen's off, and changing the songs this way, as I often do, say in the car, yeah, it's workable, but it's a bit kludgy. But still, it's a nice idea for carrying stuff around, or having a set which you can at least pick up. It has everything together in one lot. And that, I think, well, if they designed this case, I think it was a good effort, if an imperfect one. But at least you have, places and a little carry strap here, places to carry all your stuff. Have this, and which I haven't unwrapped. It's a good effort, that's for sure. Well, let's talk about the signature for a little bit. Now, if you saw my review of that, I thought it was kind of warm, like a nice, pleasant sound, but kind of not the most resolving. And it wasn't, didn't really kind of thrill me a great deal more than Chord's good old Mojo. Now, the interesting thing about the Diablo is you're paying, about a couple $100 more for basically more resolution, and the upgrade to the amp module to their new, I suppose, THX kind of like, cascading negative feedback, I don't know if that's the correct term, amp in here has definitely upped the resolution. And I don't think it's necessarily because they removed features, but it's definitely the new amp module makes for a noticeable difference. And it kind of moved the things from like the DSD, the signature was like, yeah, okay, that's nice, but I don't really want to listen with it. It wasn't the kind of thing that I kind of grabbed to want to listen to music with. The Diablo, on the other hand, has pushed things up to the point where I can grab this and enjoy listening to music with it. It's the kind of thing I want to kind of listen to music with. Now, the main thing about it, of course, is that it drives full-sized headphones. If you only need to drive in-ear monitors, I mean, there are plenty of DAPs which are cheaper or kind of around that price, or this is over $1,000, or the ones under $1,000, where you can drive in-ear monitors perfectly well, but the under $1,000 kind of full-sized headphones, well, they're kind of limited, whereas you need to go over $1,000 with something like this Cayenne N6 Mark II to get really kind of better full-size headphone driving performance, but none of them can output 4 watts. And this would even drive the good old Susvaras, which I have sitting here. It's like, sounds ridiculous, but it was that ridiculous. It actually would drive them, and drive them pretty well. I mean, not as good as the desktop amps, which are all sitting above me here, but all the same, it would do it, and it was enjoyable, and you could listen with it. Now, of course, you probably drain the battery pretty fast. I think probably the more regrettable thing is that with in-ear monitors, the gain was just way too high. So now I've drained the battery, flattened the battery, as I said before, but here you turn the volume on, you have this massive channel imbalance until you get to about 10 o'clock, and so you only have about 180 degrees of range. But here, with in-ear monitors, even out of the 6.3mm socket, it was just too loud. And that was really regrettable. And I just wish they'd included the IEM match by default, or a lower gain still on this, and made a 3.5mm socket there instead. That would have been much better. Or just a dedicated in-ear monitor socket, because that would have made for a great all-round device. But of course, where these things shine is with full-sized headphones. And for that, it did a really good job. Maybe not quite as good as, it's just out of view, but the Jotunheim 2 and Bifrost 2 combo is still going to drive headphones better. It's still going to be more clear, kind of more depth to the sound, but still, I mean, for a transportable or portable device, I found this just very enjoyable to listen with. Whether I was listening, whatever high-end headphones I have floating around here, from Final, Meze, Hi-Fi Man, and the Focal Utopias are under the desk at the moment, but that worked out actually pretty impressively well. Now, the sound signature itself, so if you imagine an iFi uses the Burr Brown PCM 1793, I gather that's what's in here. I've always said this thing about DAC chips, they all have this subtly different kind of sound to them. So for example, in here we have a Sabre DAC, and in this HiBR6 Mark II, And this has, I kind of think of the Saber DACs as being like metal. They're kind of a little bit more aggressive, sharper, sometimes a little bit too much of that cannot be a good thing. Whereas you have also, for example, this has an AKM 4497. It's one of the high-end AKM DACs. This 4497 and 4499 are the high-end ones. They are kind of like glass. So it's like looking through a glass window at the music. It's not quite being there, but it's kind of smooth and pleasant. It can be really engaging to listen with, especially if you use high-quality upsampling software on your computer. And then you have Burr Brown, which is what's in here. And actually, I think I may have... Yes, I've got the Burr Brown-based module in here as well. They are kind of, I consider, like wood. I kind of like a more organic, more characterful sound. I mean, it just really sounds like you're listening to music. Now, there's an interesting thing because there's this guy on HeadFi who was really insistent to me about how it sounds way better than his Chord Hugo 1. And I have a Chord Hugo 1 here too. Just ignore the scribblings on it, which were instructions for someone else to use it because it was confusing. This is, well, it was a revolutionary product at the time. The Chord Hugo 2 is still kind of the gold standard for the most resolving portable device out there. But I did listen to the Chord Hugo 1 against the Diablo. The Chord Hugo 1 and kind of the Mojo are roughly about the same resolving ability, at least in my impression anyway, although the sound signature is slightly different. These sounded, the Mojo and the Chord Hugo 1, sounded kind of boring in comparison to the Diablo. I mean, they're just much less engaging. They were kind of, boring is probably the easiest word. And I never found the Mojo to be boring sounding. But in comparison, it just was noticeably less exciting. I mean, so was the iDSD signature. And the Diablo just took a step up and said, nah, let's just do this right. And I just found it very engaging to listen with. The music sounded like music. Like it had, engaging is the word for it. Now, the resolution wasn't the best. It wasn't, in Hugo 2 territory. It's just not going to be able to do that, not with a regular DAC chip and a regular kind of setup. And it didn't have like the best soundstage depth. I mean, the default digital filter in here is non-oversampling. They call it bit perfect, but it means non-oversampling. And that, of course, cannot reproduce a perfect soundstage in depth or width. It just becomes a little bit blurry, but it's not so bad with something like these. And I did play with upsampling, but there's also available firmware with the GTO filter from iFi. And in some respects, I like that filter. In some ways, I don't. It brings the music really forward versus the high tap filters and the chord gear, which kind of gives you an even, deep sound stage with music, with high quality 2-channel recordings at least. And the GTO filter makes the music more exciting. And supposedly it's based on MQA filters. Well, designed with help from MQA. It's essentially an MQA filter, going by measurements done of it. And some people like that, some people don't. I just kept it with a kind of bit perfect, ideally. That's worked out best for me. It worked best when I used the USB input and upsampling from HQ Player, which again is a $300 software product. And that produced the best results, either upsampling to, 384K PCM or DSD 256, I think. 512 is just overkill. And that made for a much more kind of a nicer, smoother sound. Whereas with the Diablo, it sounded a bit like musical transients were a little bit cut off on the edges, and maybe a little bit like it's like kind of like a sharpness filter on image editing software. It kind of a little bit artificial sharpness in there, and still it was nice to listen with, but it would obviously bested by high quality software. And soundstage, even with connecting up to the hi-fi with using this 4.4mm to dual 3-pin XLR cable, which it came with from the balanced output at the back. That makes this a DAC, so that you have no volume control. But it was still pleasant to listen with, but it felt like the soundstage wasn't as wide or as deep as you could get with better DACs. I have here, you can see the Yggdrasil just sitting here as an example. So it's still better to be had, but it was engaging and enjoyable enough that as a thing to grab and listen, it really did the job for me. One of the disappointing things about that actually is when I hooked this up to my hi-fi and I had to go through the USB. Now, it's hard to say how much of this is my fault, but I had some ground loop hum, and I eliminated that by going through a different route. And the problem is a lot of portable devices, when music stops coming in, they automatically shut off to try and preserve battery, and this did too. Unfortunately, it shut off the output on the balanced output at the back, and then when the music cut off, a second later you go burp, and the hum would come back because it had cut off the well, whatever it was to prevent the ground loop. And that was kind of a little bit less than ideal. So kind of as a device, I just found it really, they almost did it. They almost nailed it. They're just with a couple of things. Now, I don't care for the extra bass in 3D, so for other people who would probably might prefer the signature. But with, in really engaging sound and headphone drive, and just being generally really listenable, they did so well. But I just wish, first of all, they'd abolished this power switch included volume knob, because for a start, the gain was just way too high. There was not enough volume level to manage things. Even in echo mode, the gain was way too high. In-ear monitors just don't work so well without the IEM match, and the IEM match was a little bit flawed in the signature too. Just that, and the fact that you have different, the firmware and the digital filters are neither here nor there for me. The difference is fairly subtle, so I'm not too worried about that. But they kind of eliminate, you pay more, you get much better sound quality, but you eliminated some of the things that really make iFi what they are, such as the IEM match and the extra bass in 3D. Well, they're neither here nor there for me. So it's kind of almost there, and apart from the niggles when I use the balanced output, they almost nailed it. And price-wise, that's kind of a tricky thing. Is it worth more? Well, sonic-wise, I think it may be about right. But if they'd actually separated the power switch out of here and maybe included the IEM match, it'd be absolutely, 100% recommendation for me. As it is, I really like it if you want to drive full-sized headphones, and maybe sometimes connect it to a hi-fi system. But yeah, just those two little things: the volume control and the lack of the gain being too high in general. Even in echo mode, the gain was too high. With full-sized headphones, maybe I just don't listen that loud. Just those things, and it could have been so good. And I don't really need 4 watts of output. Yeah, just too much. So close, yet so far. Lastly, before you go, thanks to everyone who supported making these videos. If you have a question or something you'd like to influence what I review, you'd like to see my impressions of gear before everyone else does, that kind of thing, do consider supporting me. Check out the link that you see on screen or in the description, and help me out, and I'll happily help you out with advice for what you should buy and shouldn't buy in your audio journey. As always, if you have owned one of these, actually do leave a comment below and tell me what you think of it. If you have any impressions or anything I might have missed in my review of it, I'll try to cover as much as I could reasonably could. And as always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online.